Imagine, stuck, no way out. The internal door handle was simply too high. So I just had to wait and wait. And to be honest with you, gents' toilets are not the greatest places. But the day had started so well. A really early start. The taxi had picked me up from my house and taken me to the local railway station. My tickets were pre-booked and on my phone, which makes things much more accessible. And I got a seat on the train going into London. Once I got to the station at London, the first issue, the lifts were out of order, not particularly unusual. But I can do some steps. So I got in, I walked up the stairs and got in to another taxi and got across London to another main London train station. And I worked out very quickly that it was going to be easier for me to walk from the entrance to the train rather than walk to the mobility buggy centre and get a buggy to the train. So that's what I did. I had a comfortable ride down to the southwest, and there was a taxi that met me at the end and took me to the venue. And I could see the relief of the conference organisers as I turned up. I was one of the keynote speakers, and they had wanted me to stay overnight. But due to my disability, travel is always slightly more difficult, so I said I would get up early and I'd make it. The relief on their face. I do a lot of presentations, but the one thing that remains is nerves. So how do I deal with nerves? Well, I probably go to the gents' toilets 3 or 4 times in the run-up to a presentation, and that's when it all unraveled and I couldn't get out. Just think about you delivering a key message to a big audience when you're flustered, you've got beads of perspiration, and you've realised you've travelled 4 hours and you nearly missed it because you got stuck in the gents' toilets. You may think in 2023 accessible toilets are simply there. They're not always near to the other toilets. In a lot of cases, they are filled with mops and buckets as a second cleaning place. And often the toilets are higher in order that wheelchair users can slide across and use them. For someone who is 3'10", that is not useful for me. But I tell you this because I want to tell you the realities of being disabled. I was born with my disability. Some people call me Mike. Others call me a 17%er because 17% of disabled people were born with their disability. You can do the maths. That means that 83% of disabled people will acquire their disability in their lifetime. So I was born with short legs. I was born with one finger, but I'm not ill. And I travelled independently that day for 350 miles only to get stuck by a door handle. So my question to you today is a door handle too much to ask society in order to gain my full participation? And let me just share with you some stats and some facts. only 8% of disabled people are wheelchair users. So when we think about the other 92% of 14.1 million people, 80% have hidden disabilities. They can walk into this auditorium today and you would not necessarily know that they were disabled and may have reasonable adjustments. I walk up and on stage, it doesn't take you long to work out I'm disabled. But if you're neurodivergent, Asperger's, autism, dyslexia, diabetes, epilepsy, you can choose whether to disclose or not to disclose. And then there is the commercial discussions about disability, the purple pound, the consumer spending power of disabled people and their families, which equates to £274 billion a year and is rising at 14% compound. But yet, only 10% of businesses have any strategy to access this disability market. And I will tell you, in terms of the online market, £17.1 billion is lost every year as disabled people go on online websites and don't make a purchase of a product or a service due to inaccessibility or poor customer service. So if we are going to mind the gap for disabled people, firstly, we need to know and understand who we are talking about. And secondly, and equally as important, that small changes can make a big difference. And I just want to go back briefly to the definition. How many of you, when you walked in today, knew that cancer was a disability even if you had recovered fully from cancer? And in the world that we're living in today, what we're seeing is the growth of long COVID, people who have the condition over 12 months. And it's estimated that by the end of this year, we could see another 400,000 disabled people. And if you use that broad definition of disability, I'll ask you the question, on that definition, how many of you, therefore, have someone in your family who you're related to, or someone in your close network that would have a disability? And I've had the opportunity in conferences over the last year to talk to audiences where there is polling. And I've asked that question, and the answers range from 87% to 92%. So when you look at it in the round, actually, disability is an issue that has resonance for so many people. It's actually the largest minority group in the world. So when we talk about minding the gap, this is not just something that governments do. This is not just a call to action for businesses. This is something for each and every one of you. And in terms of that, you need to reorientate your thinking of disability from something which is about vulnerable people, charity, and welfare, to something which is about opportunity, value, contribution, and community. And so therefore, you have to be part of changing the disability conversation. And you can be a part of changing that conversation. And let me share with you the how. Firstly, it's awareness. And why wouldn't you think most disabled people are wheelchair users when you see the international sign for disability, which is a wheelchair? And you can go wherever you like in the world and you will see that sign. But let me just reaffirm, wheelchair users comprise 8% of 14.1 million disabled people in the UK. They represent only 8% of 17% of the global population which has a disability. But it's about more than awareness. It's about understanding. Understanding the door handle is the disabling barrier. I cannot tell you what it is to be blind. But what I do know is that if blind people use screen readers, most websites don't read screen readers. And if they do, for example, with web pages where stylistically the first line is often in capitalization, they will read that as acronyms. So welcome to a brand becomes WELCOME space TO. And quite frankly, most blind people have had enough and jump off before they make a purchase. And just think about the 3 million colourblind people in this country who will get absolutely lost if websites are only navigated by red, amber and green. And I always say to web developers, keep your colour navigation, but put in the words as well. And suddenly you've got 3 million more people that can follow you and be part of your brand. And in terms of understanding, I want to just describe the concept of microaggressions that in some ways, as part of understanding, can be even more corrosive. And I've talked to you about travel and how much travel I do. And I was in a taxi in London about 2 weeks ago. And I got out of the taxi and I saw this guy in the corner of my eye, came racing over to the taxi and insisted on taking my briefcase and helping me across the road. I said I was fine, it was okay, but he insisted. What he didn't know is I am terribly lopsided and that actually with the briefcase on my arm, it actually counterbalances for me and makes me more mobile. So actually taking away that from me made me more disabled. But I use that example because I don't want us to mix that with acts of kindness. And if we ever lose acts of kindness, then we all pack our bags and we go home. And the following night I was in London again and the rain was pouring. Now, I don't use coats because I can't get coats on and off. So sometimes I get lucky and sometimes I simply don't. And I was standing waiting for a taxi and this woman came over to me and she said, I have an umbrella. Do you want to stand in the queue with me and we can share it? Absolutely an act of kindness. I spent 15 minutes talking to her, never got to know her name, but actually She will be etched in my memory forever. And probably if you ever hear me speak again about this topic, she will come up in conversation. 2 hours later, I was on the train going home, and someone walked past and just said to me, people like you shouldn't be out at times like this. So there's the different ways of awareness, different ways of understanding, and then getting involved. And getting involved in the right way in changing the conversation. And I'm going to give you a really good example. It's called the 6-second rule. It's when you ask your question to someone who is on the neurodivergent spectrum, whether it's autism, whether it's Asperger's, or whether it's someone who's just got a stammer. You ask the question, and then in your mind, you count to 6. And that enables that individual to process the question that you have asked, and then time to think about the answer for which they will give a much fully enriched response. We are all human creatures. We don't like silence. And up until I knew that 6-second rule, I would sit there, and after about 1.5 seconds, I would jump in and gleefully answer my own question for that individual, much to their frustration. Why? Because it wasn't their answer, and 2, because it was wrong. And I know it really is transformative for people on the spectrum. And I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, and the person on the panel had ADHD. And someone asked her a question, and the entire audience just sat and waited for 6 seconds. She then produced one of the most brilliant answers ever, and at the end said, it is the first time anyone had waited 6 seconds, and it's the best answer I've ever given to an audience. The impact of people wanting to get involved, learning just that 6-second rule, was absolutely immense. And once you're involved, you then can engage. And during lockdown, I spent a lot of time with organisations on virtual calls. And I was with a big corporate. And every Friday morning, they did a thank goodness it's Friday. And the chief executive would figuratively stand up and talk to every member of the staff. And he talked that morning about why disability, why mental health was so important to that organisation, particularly mental health, where staff and their family had really struggled through lockdown. And then he did that dreadful thing when he said, I'd like to invite people to come off mute and tell us what you think. And I can tell you, it felt much longer silence than 6 seconds. But then someone did. And they said, I cannot believe I'm working for an organisation where the chief executive has talked about mental health and disability. So today, after 15 years, I'm going to tell all my colleagues that I've got a mental health issue and I've covered it up, but no longer. A split second later, someone came off and said, well, if he's going to tell you that, I'm going to tell you that I've been diagnosed with dyslexia for 17 years. I go home every night and I do an additional 1.5 hours to keep my head afloat. But today's the day I'm telling you. 6 minutes later, that chief executive had 9 more disabled staff than he had when he started. but what he had was 350 other staff that were engaged and understood and were empathetic, not sympathetic. And what it tells you, and what it should tell all of you, is that small changes can make a huge difference. So the challenge for you today, this afternoon, is to walk away from here and become the connectors, become the spark, become the electricity. Plug yourself in to disability, to one of your relatives or someone in your close network, and maybe determine you're going to walk away here and you're going to implement the 6-second rule when it comes up. Be the connector. For some of you, using the same analogy, you can also be a conductor for other people. And by conductor, I don't mean standing in front of an orchestra waving a baton, but for some of you who have lived experience, whether it's you or a relative, you actually might become that conductor as well. Awareness, understanding, involvement, and engagement. Those 4 words can create a disability inclusive world. And you can be absolute allies in creating that world. And when we do, having no arms will not matter as you all become the collective door handle. Thank you.